The candle had burned down to almost nothing. Lottie noticed it the moment she stepped into the east corridor. That small, stubborn flame fighting against the draft that crept through the stone walls of Ashenvale Keep, whistling low like a warning no one wanted to hear. She paused for just a moment, watching it flicker, and thought, I know exactly how you feel. Then she shifted the copper basin in her arms and kept walking. The water inside had already gone cold. She'd heated it twice that morning, and twice she'd been turned away from the king's chamber. First by the head steward, a narrow man named Perrin, who looked at her the way one looks at mud on a clean floor, and then by the king's personal guard, a wall of leather and iron who simply said not yet without meeting her eyes. Now it was past the second bell of morning. The frost had crawled beneath the heavy oak doors of the keep, and Lottie's fingers were going numb around the basin's rim. She was 23 years old, and had been a maid at Ashenvale Keep for 8 months, long enough to learn which floorboards groaned, which fireplaces smoked, and which members of the court it was safest to become invisible around. Not long enough to stop noticing things she probably shouldn't. Things like the fact that the king's chamber always smelled of pine resin and leather, not the sourness of a sick room. Things like the way the silence behind that heavy door felt too deliberate, too still, as if someone on the other side was choosing it rather than being claimed by it. Things like the careful distance everyone kept from the truth. King Tristan of Ashenvale had been paralyzed for 3 months. That was what the court said. That was what the healer, old Marin, whispered with lowered eyes whenever anyone asked. That was what Lady Seraphine, the Luna, the woman everyone expected to rule beside him, announced with practiced grief at every council meeting, her pale hands folded over her heart, her dark eyes rimmed with the precise amount of sorrow a person rehearses rather than feels. Lottie had never been inside the king's chamber. She wasn't supposed to be. Maids of her rank, low, without family name, without pack standing, were assigned to the outer corridors, the guest rooms, the cold stone floors of the lower hall. The king's personal quarters were tended by 2 senior attendants, a woman named Hilda, broad and silent, and a young man called Corin, who moved like he was always slightly afraid. But Hilda had fallen ill that morning with a fever that reddened her cheeks and made her hands shake. And Corin had been summoned to the eastern border with a message that hadn't waited. And Perrin, narrow, fussy Perrin, had looked at the list of available staff with thinly concealed panic and landed on Lottie's name with something that felt like reluctant surrender. You will bring the basin. Place it on the table by the window. Add the dried cedar from the shelf near the door, and leave, he'd told her, each word clipped as if he were rationing them. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look directly at the king. You will not touch anything other than the table. Is that understood? Yes, sir, she'd said. What she had not said. Why does it matter if I look at him? What she had not said. Why would a paralyzed man care about eye contact? Now she stood before the chamber door, the basin growing heavier with each breath, the cold cedar branches from the shelf tucked under her arm, and she raised her knuckles and knocked twice. Soft, the way Hilda had taught new staff to knock on any door that mattered. Silence. Then, low and even as a stone dropped into still water, come in. The room was not what she'd expected. She had imagined illness. She had imagined the heavy smell of medicinal herbs, damp wool, unwashed linens. She'd imagined the particular stillness of a body that could not move. A wasting kind of stillness, sunken and sad. Instead, the chamber of King Tristan smelled of pine smoke and old leather, and something underneath it all that she couldn't name, but that made the back of her neck prickle, animal and instinctive, the way a wolf's does when it senses something larger nearby. The fire in the great stone hearth was burning strong. Maps covered the long table near the window. She could see the ink lines of mountain ranges, the dotted marks of territory borders, and beside them were stacked books, their spines cracked with genuine use. 2 iron candle holders rose tall on either side of a carved chair, and in that chair, draped in a fur of dark wolf pelt, sat the king. Lottie kept her eyes low. She focused on crossing the room, on not spilling the cold water, on finding the table Perrin had described. But she could see him anyway, in fragments, the way one observes lightning, quickly, involuntarily. Dark braids pulled back from a sharp face, a jaw set hard as the stone walls around him. Leather armor buckled across a chest that did not look like the chest of a man reduced by illness. Wide shoulders draped in wolf fur, dark as midnight. And eyes, when they turned toward her, that were the startling pale blue of ice over a deep river. Not the clouded, distant eyes of a man retreating inward. Clear, watchful, completely deliberately present. She set the basin on the table. She placed the cedar branches beside it. She turned to leave. "You're not Hilda," he said. His voice was even, not accusatory, just a fact placed in the air between them. "No, Your Grace," Lottie said. "Hilda is unwell. I've been sent in her place." A pause. She kept her back half-turned, following instructions, not looking directly. "What's your name?" "Lottie, Your Grace. I serve in the East Corridor." Another pause. Longer this time. She felt it like pressure, like the moment before a storm when the air holds its breath. "You can go, Lottie, from the East Corridor." She went. She crossed the room and reached the door and closed it behind her with both hands, careful and quiet, and stood for a moment in the cold corridor with her heart beating strangely fast. She walked back to the east wing. She returned the empty basin to the shelf. She sat on the low stool by the window and looked at her hands and tried to think about nothing at all. But her mind kept circling back, relentless, like a wolf returning to a trail. His legs had been resting on a low footstool beneath the fur. The position of a man at rest, not of a man incapable of movement. The fur had shifted when he'd turned to speak to her, shifted at the hip, at the thigh, the subtle, unconscious shift of a body that still works. And his hands, the right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, the fingers had been slightly curled. Not limp. Curled. The hand of a man who was holding still on purpose. Lottie pressed her palms flat against her thighs and stared at the frost on the window glass. She was a maid with no pack name, and no standing, and no business noticing things. She told herself that twice. 3 times. It didn't help. 3 corridors away, in the council chamber, Lady Seraphine was already speaking. Lottie heard her voice before she saw her. She'd been sent to collect linens from the council room's antechamber, which shared a thin wall with the meeting space itself, and the lady's voice carried the way it always did. Smooth, precisely weighted, filling every corner of every room it entered. "The healer's assessment remains unchanged," Seraphine was saying. "The king requires complete rest and isolation. Any decisions regarding the eastern border must be made by the council in his name." Lottie paused in the antechamber doorway, arms full of folded linen. Through the thin wall she heard the voice of Lord Cedric, the oldest of the council members, white-haired and sharp-minded, say, "And you speak for the council's decision, my lady." "I speak for the king's well-being," Seraphine said, with exactly the right weight of quiet dignity. "As his Luna, that is my purpose." Lottie picked up the linens and moved away down the corridor. She thought about the maps on the king's table, the books with their cracked spines, the clear blue eyes that had watched her cross the room with something that was absolutely not the blurred gaze of a man surrendered to illness. And she thought about Lady Seraphine's voice, the practiced precision of it, the way it shaped grief and devotion like clay into something that looked exactly right from every angle. She thought, someone in this keep is lying. And she thought, I am far too small and far too unimportant to be the one who finds out which one it is. She thought that. She believed it even. But the thing about noticing, the true deep trouble with it, is that once you start, you cannot stop. The next morning, Hilda was worse. Lottie could hear her coughing from the far end of the corridor, a wet, rattling sound that bounced off the stone walls and made the other maids glance at each other with the particular discomfort of people who don't want to be inconvenienced by someone else's suffering. Perrin appeared at the 7th bell with his list and his pinched expression, and Lottie already knew what was coming before his eyes found her name. "Again," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," she said. It wasn't enthusiasm. This time the water was hot. She'd made sure of it, wrapping the basin in a folded cloth to keep the warmth in while she walked the long corridor from the kitchen hearth to the east wing. The cedar branches were fresh. She'd gone to the courtyard herself at first light to cut them from the low shrub that grew against the keep's outer wall. Her breath misting in the frozen air. Her boots leaving dark prints in the skin of frost on the stone. The cold had bitten at her fingers and the tips of her ears, and she'd worked quickly, thinking of nothing except the task. That was what she'd told herself. Nothing except the task. She knocked twice on the heavy door. "Come in," he said, the same as before. Low and even. The room was warmer today. The fire had been built higher, and the pine smoke was thicker, curling lazily toward the stone ceiling. The maps were still on the table, but rearranged. Some folded, some newly opened, the eastern territories spread wide with fresh ink marks at the borderlines. Someone had been working. She crossed to the table, set down the basin, laid the cedar branches. "You cut those yourself," he said. She stopped, turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. "Your Grace." "The cedar. The cuts are uneven. Hilda uses a proper knife and trims the ends cleanly." A pause. "Yours are snapped. You used your hands." Lottie looked down at her fingers. The small red marks where the woody stems had bitten into her skin were still visible. She hadn't thought to hide them. "The trimming knife was being used in the kitchen, Your Grace. I didn't want to wait." Another pause. She had the strong and unsettling feeling of being studied. Not unkindly, but thoroughly, the way one studies a map before deciding on a route. "You wanted the water to still be hot when it arrived," he said. It wasn't a question either. Just another fact placed carefully in the air. "Yes, Your Grace." She heard him shift in the chair, that slight, deliberate movement, and she kept her eyes on the table, on the basin's copper surface, on her own distorted reflection in the water. "You may go," he said. She went. But at the door, her hand already on the iron latch, his voice came again. "Lottie." She turned, and this time, against every instruction Perrin had given, against every careful habit she'd built in 8 months of making herself small and invisible, she looked directly at him. He was watching her with those pale blue eyes, and there was something in them that wasn't the expression of a king addressing a maid. It was more careful than that, more specific. "Tomorrow," he said, "bring 2 cups." She didn't answer. She simply nodded once and closed the door. In the corridor, she stood very still and breathed. 2 cups. She told no one. This was not difficult. Lottie had no particular friends among the keep's staff. She was polite. She was reliable. She did her work without complaint. And she went to her small room in the servants' wing each night and sat by the narrow window and watched the stars appear over the dark line of the forest beyond the keep's walls. The other maids thought her quiet. The senior staff thought her forgettable. That had always suited her perfectly. But she thought about those 2 cups through the rest of that day and into the night. Lying on her narrow straw mattress with her cloak pulled over her for warmth, staring at the ceiling's rough stone while the wind moved through the gaps in the shutters like something breathing. A king who was supposed to be paralyzed, asking for 2 cups. 2 cups meant conversation. 2 cups meant he intended to sit across from her, a maid, no name, no standing, and speak. Not at her. With her. Why? She turned it over and over, the way you turn a stone in your palm, looking for the seam that reveals what's inside. The only answer that made any sense was one she didn't want to look at directly. Because looking at it directly meant accepting that her instincts from the first morning were right. And if they were right, then everything the court believed, everything Lady Seraphine declared with those folded pale hands, was constructed, deliberate. a performance maintained for reasons Lottie couldn't yet see. She fell asleep with frost building on the inside of her shutters and woke before dawn with the answer still unresolved and her hands still marked with small red lines from the cedar stems. She brought 2 cups, plain ones, from the kitchen shelf, fired clay, unglazed, the kind the lower staff used. She didn't reach for the finer ones with their painted rims. That felt wrong, somehow. Like pretending at something. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "Those are servants' cups," he said, as she set them on the table beside the basin. "I am a servant, Your Grace." Something moved across his face. Not offense. Something quieter. She thought it might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't complete itself. He gestured toward the chair across from his. A simple wooden chair, nothing like the carved throne where he sat. And Lottie looked at it for a moment and then sat down, because he was the king, and she didn't have a reasonable alternative, and because some part of her, the part that had been noticing things for 8 months, was tired of pretending she hadn't. He poured from the clay pitcher himself. His hand was steady. His arm moved with full, controlled strength. She watched him do it, and said nothing. He set her cup in front of her. He settled back into his chair, and then he looked at her with those ice river eyes and said, with no preamble at all, "How long have you known?" The fire snapped. A log shifted in the hearth. Lottie wrapped both hands around the warm cup and held his gaze and said, "Since the first morning, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What gave it away?" "Your hands," she said. "A man who cannot move doesn't hold his fingers that way." "And the maps." She glanced at the table, at the fresh ink marks. "Someone drew those borderlines recently. They're not old marks." He followed her gaze to the maps and then brought it back to her. "You're not frightened." "I'm terrified, Your Grace," she said, honestly. But being frightened doesn't make a thing less true. For the first time, the smile completed itself. Brief, and not entirely warm, more like a crack in stone that shows what's underneath. But real. Unguarded in a way that the rest of his face was not. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." He drank from his cup. She drank from hers. The fire burned between them, and the wind pushed against the keep's walls outside, and the silence was not the silence of a sick room. "You won't speak of this," he said. Not harshly, but with the certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "No, Your Grace." "Not to Perrin, not to Hilda, not to anyone." "No." He studied her again with that thorough, root-finding attention. "Why not? You could trade that information for a great deal. A better position, protection, favor with the lady." Lottie thought about Lady Seraphine's voice through the thin council wall, the practiced weight of it, the clay-smooth grief. "I don't want favor with the lady," she said carefully. Something shifted in his eyes at that, a slight sharpening, focused and intent. He didn't ask her to explain. He simply nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Come tomorrow," he said. "Same time." She stood, pushed the chair back, gathered the empty cups. At the door she paused, and said, because she was already too far into noticing things to stop now, "Your Grace, whatever it is you're testing for." She kept her voice low and even. "I hope you find it before someone gets hurt." She didn't wait for his answer. She let herself out into the cold corridor and walked back to the east wing, with her heart hammering against her ribs, and her mind already turning, already following the thread. Behind her, in the warm, pine-scented chamber, King Tristan sat very still in his chair and looked at the closed door for a long time. He had spent 3 months waiting for someone in this keep to see clearly. He had not expected it to be her. Lady Seraphine wore grief the way other women wore jewelry. Lottie observed this from her position near the great hall's side passage, a stack of folded table linens in her arms, invisible in the way that useful. Nameless people always are in rooms full of important ones. The lady moved through the space with the particular grace of someone who had practiced being watched. Her dark gown trailing against the stone floor, her pale hands gesturing with measured sorrow as she spoke to Lord Cedric and the two younger council members flanking him like nervous birds. She was beautiful in the way that winter landscapes are beautiful, striking from a distance, cold up close. The healer believes another month, perhaps 2, Seraphine was saying, her voice carrying the precise resonance of controlled sadness. We must be prepared for all possibilities. The pack cannot remain without stable leadership indefinitely. Lord Cedric's white eyebrows drew together. He was the oldest of the council, and Lottie had noticed that he listened to Seraphine with the careful attention of a man who had learned to hear not just words, but the architecture behind them. The king has not authorized a transfer of decision-making authority, my lady. Not formally. The king, Seraphine said softly, is not in a position to authorize anything. A small silence, delicate as frost on glass. Of course, Cedric said. His voice gave nothing away. Lottie moved on down the passage, the linen still in her arms, her face arranged into the blank expression of someone thinking about nothing at all. She was thinking about everything. That evening, after the fires in the east corridor had been banked for the night, and the other maids had retreated to the warmth of the servants' hall, Lottie sat on her low stool and turned the pieces over in her mind, the way a craftsman turns raw material, looking for shape, for structure, for what it wanted to become. Tristan was not paralyzed. This she knew with certainty now, confirmed not just by her own observation, but by the way he'd poured that morning, the way he'd shifted his weight in the chair, the way he breathed. The deep, controlled breath of a man in full possession of his body. He was testing something. He'd told her as much, or nearly. He was watching his court from inside the cage of a false illness, waiting for someone or something to reveal itself. And Seraphine, the Luna, the woman who stood at the center of every council meeting with her sculpted sorrow, was already moving. Already speaking of prepared possibilities and stable leadership and the king's inability to authorize anything. 3 months. That was how long this had been in motion. Lottie thought about the border maps, the fresh ink. Whatever was happening at the eastern edge of Ashenvale's territory, Tristan knew about it. He was tracking it from his chamber, alone, while his court believed him helpless. She pressed her fingertips against the cold stone of the windowsill and stared at the dark tree line beyond the keep's walls and thought, he is hunting something. And whatever it is, it's already inside this keep. The thought settled over her like a second cloak, heavier than wool, colder than the night air. She should stay small. She should stay invisible. She should carry linens and cut cedar branches and say yes. Sir de Perrin's clipped instructions, and let whatever was unfolding between a king and his Luna resolve itself without her. She pressed her fingertips harder against the cold stone. She had never been very good at staying invisible when it mattered. The next morning she brought the cups again, and this time she also brought a question. She set everything on the table, turned, and said, without preamble, "The eastern border. There's been movement there for weeks. The guard rotation changed. I noticed it because the night patrol passes my window, and the timing shifted. And Lord Cedric received a sealed message last week that he didn't share with the full council." Tristan looked at her from his chair. The wolf fur was draped over his shoulders today, dark against the leather of his armor, and in the morning light through the lead-paned window, his pale eyes were almost colorless. Watching her the way the sky watches the ground before a storm. "You notice a great deal," he said. "I told you that already, Your Grace." "So you did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sit down, Lottie." She sat. He leaned forward, the movement easy, fluid, the movement of a man who had perhaps forgotten, for just a moment, that he was supposed to be still, and rested his forearms on his knees and looked at her directly. "What I am about to tell you," he said, "cannot leave this room. You've already established that, Your Grace. I'm establishing it again. Because this is different from what you already know. His jaw tightened. If what I suspect is confirmed, people I have trusted for years have been working against this pack, against this territory, against everything Ashenvale stands for. And if that becomes known before I have proof, real proof, not suspicion, it will tear this court apart before I can stop it. Lottie held her cup in both hands and kept her breathing steady. What are you looking for? Evidence, he said, of correspondence with a rival pack, of agreements made without my knowledge, of territory being quietly traded away in exchange for something I haven't identified yet. He paused. The eastern border movement you noticed. That is not a patrol shift. That is preparation. Someone has been telling Harwick's pack where our weak points are. Harwick. She knew the name. Every person in Ashenvale did. The pack to the east, aggressive and expanding, led by a man whose ambitions had been a shadow on the territory's edge for years. The thought of their scouts near Ashenvale's borders made something cold move through her chest. And you believe the correspondence originates inside the keep, she said. He looked at her steadily. I know it does. I've seen partial evidence. Enough to be certain of the direction. Not enough to name the source without being challenged. His voice was careful now, measured. I needed the court to believe I was incapacitated. I needed whoever was responsible to feel safe enough to continue, to make a mistake. While you watched, Lottie said. While I watched. She turned her cup slowly in her hands, feeling the roughness of the unglazed clay against her palms. She thought of Seraphine's voice through the thin wall. The king is not in a position to authorize anything. The careful timing of it. The quiet confidence. Your Grace, she said slowly, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, rather than as a king. His expression didn't change, but something in the quality of his attention shifted, became, if possible, even more focused. Ask, he said. Did you choose this test because you already suspected her? The fire burned. The wind pressed against the stone. Somewhere below, in the deep corridors of the keep, she could hear the faint sounds of mourning. Boots on flags, a door closing, the distant clang of the kitchen hearth. Tristan said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been. I chose this test, he said, because 3 months ago I found a letter. It was not signed. It had been burned, mostly, in the hearth of the council antechamber, but not completely. He paused. The handwriting was familiar. Lottie waited. I have been hoping, he said, with a flatness that contained a great deal more than flatness, to be wrong. She understood then, fully, the weight of what was sitting in that room with them. Not just strategy, not just politics, but something older and more painful. The specific grief of a person who loves something and has begun to fear that what they love has never been real. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. After a moment, he straightened in his chair and picked up his cup, and the brief unguarded opening closed again like a wound sealing over. There is a council meeting in 4 days, he said. Seraphine intends to propose a formal temporary transfer of authority. I've been told through Cedric. He met her eyes. She will need the council's sealed agreement to make it binding. That means documents, and documents leave traces. You need someone to look, Lottie said. I need someone invisible, he said. She understood what he was asking. She understood exactly how far beyond her station it was, how far beyond reasonable, how far beyond every careful habit of smallness she had built for herself in 8 months of keeping her head down and her eyes low. She thought of the cedar branches, of how she hadn't waited for the trimming knife because the water needed to still be hot when it arrived. Tell me where to look, she said. Something moved through his pale eyes. Not quite relief, and not quite gratitude, but something that lived in the same territory as both. The lady's private correspondence box, he said. Oak, brass-fitted, kept on the shelf above her writing desk. She locks it at night. But during the council meetings, she leaves her chamber unattended. 4 days, Lottie said. 4 days, he confirmed. She stood, gathered the cups, and turned toward the door. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. Lottie. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, unarmored, almost uncertain, which on a face like his looked like a crack in a fortress wall. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, "I will not be able to protect you from the consequences of what you've agreed to." She held his gaze. "I know, Your Grace." "Then why?" "Because," she said simply and precisely, "the water should still be hot when it arrives." She left him with that. And in the corridor, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of standing still with her eyes closed and her back against the cold stone wall, breathing. Then she straightened her cloak, adjusted the cups in her arms, and walked back toward the east wing with her mind already mapping the route to Seraphine's chamber. 4 days. It was enough. It had to be. The 4 days passed the way dangerous things often do, quietly, ordinarily, with the deceptive calm of water that looks still but runs fast beneath the surface. Lottie went about her work. She carried linens and refilled oil lamps and swept frost from the inner courtyard stones each morning, while her breath misted in the gray winter air. She nodded to Perrin's instructions. She exchanged brief, polite words with the other maids. She was, to every eye in the keep, exactly what she had always been. Unremarkable, reliable, invisible. She visited the king's chamber each morning. She brought the cups. She brought the cedar. And in the quiet space between the sound of the fire and the pressure of the wind against the stone walls, she and Tristan spoke in low voices about things that would have stunned the court into silence. He told her about the pack structure, how Ashenvale's eastern territory bordered a narrow pass that Harwick's pack had been trying to control for 2 generations. How that pass, if surrendered, would give Harwick's wolves access to the valley settlements, the grain stores, the river routes that fed 3 smaller packs who looked to Ashenvale for protection. It wasn't just a border dispute. It was the slow, strategic dismantling of everything the territory depended on, and it was being accomplished not through force, but through quiet negotiation conducted without the king's knowledge or consent. She told him what she'd observed. She was precise and thorough. The rotation of the night guard, and when it had changed, the sealed message to Cedric, and how the old lord had held it for half a day before summoning Seraphine rather than the full council. A detail she'd noticed because she'd been in the corridor when the messenger arrived, and again when Cedric had walked, alone and unhurried, toward the ladies' chambers. Tristan listened to her the way he studied maps, with complete, serious attention, asking specific questions, treating her observations as information rather than coincidence. No one had ever done that before. It was, Lottie found, both more comfortable and more dangerous than being ignored. On the 3rd morning, he said, "You grew up outside the pack system." It wasn't a question. She'd begun to understand that with him, very few things were. "Yes," she said. "My mother was unaffiliated. We moved often." She paused, then added, because he had been honest with her and it seemed only right. She was afraid of pack politics. She said packs were just power dressed in loyalty's clothing. He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't entirely wrong. No, Lottie agreed, but she wasn't entirely right either. He looked at her. "What changed your mind?" She thought about it honestly before answering. "Watching Hilda," she said finally. "The senior maid. When she got sick, 3 different people from the lower staff quietly left food outside her door. No one asked them to. No one would have known if they hadn't." She turned her cup in her hands. "That's pack too. It's not just the power." Tristan said nothing for a long moment. When she glanced at him, he was looking at the fire with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when something had reached him past the fortress walls. He didn't comment, but his jaw was less tight when he turned back to the maps. The council meeting was called for the 4th afternoon, just as Cedric had reported. The great hall filled with the sound of boots and voices. All 7 council members, plus Seraphine in a deep gray gown. Her dark hair pinned with silver, moving to the head of the long table as naturally as water finds the lowest point. Lottie watched from the upper corridor as the heavy doors swung shut. Then she turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction. Seraphine's chambers were in the south tower, warmer than the east wing, better furnished, with a window that looked out over the keep's inner courtyard. Lottie had memorized the route 3 days ago, walking it twice on errands that brought her legitimately close enough to study the corridor without stopping. The door was unlocked. This gave her pause. She stood before it with one hand raised and her knuckles not quite touching the wood, and thought, either this is a trap, or she simply doesn't expect anyone to dare. She decided it was the second thing. Power like Seraphine's didn't fear servants. Power like Seraphine's didn't even register them as a possibility. She went in. The room smelled of rosewater and beeswax and something sharper underneath, ink, recently used. The writing desk was against the south wall, and above it, exactly as Tristan had described, sat the oak correspondence box. Brass fittings, a small iron lock. Locked. Lottie stood before it and breathed steadily and thought about what Tristan had told her on the second morning. The lock is a standard Ashenvale pattern. The same key opens every correspondence box of that type in the keep. They were ordered in a set 15 years ago. He'd pressed a small brass key into her palm. Old, slightly tarnished, warm from where he'd been holding it. I've had this since I inherited the keep's ring. I never thought I'd need it for this. She used it now. The lock turned. The lid lifted. Inside, the box was divided into 2 sections. The left side held personal letters, folded, sealed with wax in varying colors, ordinary correspondence. The right side held something different. 4 letters. Unfolded. Recently read and refolded, the creases still sharp. The wax seals broken cleanly. The kind of clean that spoke of careful hands accustomed to opening things they shouldn't. She lifted the first one. The handwriting was angular, unfamiliar, not Seraphine's elegant script. The signature at the bottom read simply, H, with a mark beneath it that she recognized as Harwick's pack sigil. She'd seen it on the border maps in Tristan's chamber. She read it quickly, her eyes moving fast down the page. The pass agreement stands. When the transfer of authority is confirmed by council seal, delivery of the eastern coordinates will follow within the fortnight. Your patience has been noted and valued. Ashenvale's cooperation will be remembered when the valley territories are redistributed. Her stomach dropped. She read the second letter, then the third. By the fourth, her hands were completely steady, not because she was calm, but because she had moved past the shaking part into something harder and quieter. This was not negotiation. This was not political maneuvering. This was the deliberate surrender of Ashenvale's eastern pass to a rival pack, to be completed the moment Seraphine had the council's formal seal of authority. The valley settlements, 3 of them, with families, with children, with grain stores they depended on through winter, would be exposed within weeks. Harwick's wolves would move before the snow thawed. She memorized the specific phrases, the dates, the references to coordinates. She closed the box and relocked it, moving the letters back exactly as she'd found them. Same order, same fold lines, same precise arrangement. She crossed the room and let herself out and closed the door behind her, and stood in the corridor with the brass key pressed hard into her palm and the cold stone against her back. From somewhere below, through the heavy floors, she could hear the distant murmur of the council meeting. Seraphine's voice, measured and smooth, proposing the transfer of authority in the king's name. Lottie pushed herself off the wall and walked. Not quickly. Quickly draws eyes. She walked at the steady, purposeful pace of a maid with somewhere to be, through the south corridor and up the east stair, and through the narrow passage that connected to the king's wing. She reached his door, knocked twice, didn't wait. She went in. Tristan was standing. She had never seen him stand before. He was taller than she'd understood from the chair, broader, the wolf fur across his shoulders, making him look exactly like what he was, which was the most powerful thing in this keep, and possibly in several territories beyond it. He'd been at the map table, and he turned when she entered, and she registered the slight shock on his face, not at seeing her, but at reading her expression. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Everything. The exact language of the letters, the dates, the Harwick sigil, the reference to coordinates and the fortnight deadline. She spoke quickly and precisely, and he listened without interrupting, standing very still with his arms at his sides and his pale eyes fixed on her face. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the fire. "The transfer proposal," he said. His voice was level in the way that things are level just before they break. "How far along is the meeting?" "I don't know. I came directly here." He moved to the door, his stride long and even and entirely unimpaired. And she realized with a lurch that he was going to the council chamber. Now. Like this. "Your Grace." She took a half step forward. "If you walk in there, you reveal everything. Every month of—" "I know," he said without stopping. "Seraphine will deny it, without the physical letters in hand. I know that too." He paused at the door, one hand on the latch, and turned to look at her. His jaw was set. His eyes were cold in the way that ice is cold when it's thick and deep. "But I am not going to sit in that chair and listen to her hand my pack's eastern border to Harwick while I do nothing." He held her gaze for one moment. "Sometimes the water can't wait to be hot, Lottie." She blinked. Then she stepped forward, reached into the pocket of her apron, and held out the brass key. "Then take the evidence with you." He looked at the key, then at her. "She'll know someone was in the room," Lottie said. "She'll know it was me eventually. But you'll have the letters in your hand when you walk through that door, and she won't have time to deny anything before the council sees them." Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for. He took the key from her palm. "Go to Cedric's office," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Wait there. Don't go back to the East Wing. If Seraphine suspects you before I have the room secured, you'll be vulnerable. Cedric is loyal. Tell him I sent you. Use my name. Your Grace, Lottie." His voice stopped her. "I promised I couldn't protect you from the consequences of what you agreed to." His pale eyes held hers for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "I'm asking you now to let me try anyway." She held his gaze. "Go," she said. "Don't let her finish the vote." He went. His boots were silent on the stone, the trained, careful silence of a man who had been holding still for 3 months and was finally, completely done with it. Lottie stood alone in the pine-scented, fire-lit room that smelled of old leather and maps and the ghost of morning cedar, and let out a breath that had been building for 4 days. Then she picked up his empty cup from the table, carried it to the basin, and went to find Lord Cedric. Lord Cedric's office smelled of tallow candles and old parchment, and it was warm in the particular way that rooms are warm when someone has lived and worked in them for decades. A warmth that had seeped into the wood of the desk and the spines of the books and the worn surface of the chair cushions. Lottie sat on the low bench near the door and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Cedric had asked her exactly 3 questions when she'd arrived. "Did the king send you?" "Yes." "Are you safe?" "For now. Does he have what he needs?" She'd paused on that one. Then, "I believe so." The old lord had nodded once, slowly with the expression of a man whose long-held suspicions had finally been confirmed in a way he'd been hoping to avoid. He'd given her a cup of warm broth from the small pot kept near his hearth, told her to sit, and gone directly toward the great hall without another word. That had been, she estimated, watching the candle burn, nearly half an hour ago. She could hear nothing. The keep's stone walls were thick and old and kept secrets well. She sat with the broth cooling in her hands, and the brass key gone from her pocket, and nothing left to do but wait, which was, she was discovering, considerably harder than picking a lock. She thought about the letters. The specific phrasing, when the transfer of authority is confirmed by council seal, the deadline, within the fortnight. Harwick's wolves, already positioned near the eastern pass. The valley settlements sleeping through winter with no idea how close the danger had come. She thought about Tristan walking into that council room. The moment when the court would see their king, their supposedly broken, bedridden, helpless king, standing in the doorway with letters in his hand and 3 months of cold. Patient fury in his pale eyes. She thought about Seraphine's face in that moment, and found she could not quite imagine it. Some masks, when they finally broke, left nothing recognizable underneath. The door opened. Cedric came in first. He looked older than he had half an hour ago. Not shaken, but carrying something heavier than before. The weight of a man who had just watched something irreversible happen, and was still deciding how he felt about it. Behind him came a young guard, Lottie recognized from the eastern corridor. Broad-shouldered, serious-faced, who positioned himself just inside the doorway and said nothing. "It's done," Cedric said. He sat in his chair with the careful movements of a man whose knees hurt in cold weather, and who was too proud to say so. The king addressed the full council. He presented the letters. A pause. "Lady Seraphine has been taken to the South Tower under guard. Her correspondence box and all personal documents have been secured." Lottie set down the broth. The council... "Shocked," Cedric said, with a dry precision that suggested this was an understatement. Several members had no idea. 2, I suspect, had varying degrees of awareness, and are currently feeling the specific terror of people who made choices they cannot now unmake. He folded his hands on the desk. Harwick's representatives in the eastern settlements have been identified. Border scouts are already moving. She breathed. And the valley settlements? Will be warned before nightfall. He met her eyes steadily. Because of you. The words landed quietly, without ceremony. She didn't know what to do with them, so she simply nodded. "The king," Cedric said carefully, "has asked that you remain here until he comes. He was specific about that." A slight pause. "He was specific about several things, actually, which I found notable given the rather considerable number of other things demanding his attention in the last half hour." Lottie looked at her hands. "I'm a maid," she said, not with bitterness. Just as a fact, placed plainly. "Yes," Cedric said, equally plain. "You are. And you are also, apparently, the only person in this keep who looked at our king and saw clearly for 3 months, while the rest of us were either deceived or, in my case, moving too slowly." He paused. "I'm not a sentimental man, child, but I am an accurate one. What you did today mattered." She didn't answer, but she felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, but quietly. The way frozen ground shifts in early spring when the thaw begins deep below the surface where no one can see it yet. Tristan came an hour later. He came alone, which surprised her. No guard, no attendant, no council member trailing behind with scrolls and urgent questions. He came through Cedric's door as Cedric himself was discreetly leaving. The old lord passing him with a look that communicated several things in the compressed language of men who have known each other a long time. And then it was just the 2 of them in the warm, tallow-scented room. He'd removed the wolf fur. He stood in his leather armor with the buckled straps across his chest and the braids slightly loosened from whatever had happened in the council room, and he looked like what the last 3 months had been hiding. Not a man diminished by illness, but a man who had been coiled and waiting, and was only now, finally, unclenched. He looked at her for a moment. "You're all right," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not as an assessment, but as something closer to relief. "Yes, Your Grace." He crossed the room and sat in Cedric's vacated chair, which was close enough to her bench that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never been near enough to notice before. He rested his forearms on his knees, the same posture as that morning in his chamber when he'd told her the truth, and looked at her directly. "Seraphine has confirmed what the letters indicated," he said. "Not willingly, but the evidence was sufficient that denial was no longer useful to her." His jaw tightened briefly. The arrangement with Harwick was her design from the beginning. She approached them 8 months ago. 8 months. The same length of time Lottie had been at the keep. She believed, he continued, that paralysis, real or otherwise, would require the council to formalize her authority. She was already planning before I became ill. She simply found her opportunity when the healer reported that I'd been weakened by the border skirmish in autumn. And the paralysis story? Marin, the healer, was told by Seraphine that I had requested privacy about the extent of my injuries, that I didn't want the pack frightened. A pause. Marin believed her. Marin is not a conspirator. She's an old woman who trusted the Luna's word. Lottie thought of old Marin, small, gentle, always smelling of dried herbs, and felt a wave of something sad for her. She'll be devastated. Yes, he said quietly. She will. He looked at Lottie steadily. I want you to know that I chose the pretense myself. When I understood what was happening, I made the decision to let the story stand while I gathered evidence. That choice had consequences I'm responsible for, not Marin. She considered this. You could have told the council immediately. With a half-burned letter and a suspicion? He shook his head. It would have been my word against hers. Seraphine had spent months building trust and sympathy. The council would have been divided, and division was exactly what Harwick needed to move. His pale eyes were steady on her face. I needed certainty. I needed proof that couldn't be argued away. And you needed someone who could move through this keep without anyone wondering why, she said slowly. Yes, he said, though I didn't expect to find that person quite so quickly, or quite so. He paused, and something briefly unguarded moved across his face. Perceptive. She almost smiled. You asked for 2 cups on the second day. You'd already decided. You told me that being frightened didn't make a thing less true, he said. I had been surrounded for 3 months by people who were either lying to me or too frightened to tell me anything useful at all. He held her gaze. Yes, I decided. The candle on Cedric's desk flickered in a draft from the door. Outside, somewhere in the keep's lower corridors, she could hear movement. Boots, voices, the sound of a keep coming back to itself after a long suspension. What happens now? She asked. Seraphine will face the council's judgment. The formal process will take time, but the outcome is not uncertain. He was quiet for a moment. Harwick will retreat when they understand the pass agreement has collapsed. They're opportunists. Without the inside arrangement, they have no real advantage. Another pause. The valley settlements will be secured. The Eastern Guard will be rebuilt properly. And your pack? He looked at her with an expression she had seen only once before. That brief, unarmored openness, the crack in the fortress wall. My pack, he said, needs to trust its king again. And its king needs to remember that trust cannot be rebuilt in isolation. He said it carefully, precisely, like a man repeating something he'd thought over many times alone in a firelit room. I spent 3 months watching from a distance because I believed that was safer. But it was also, he admitted, easier than the alternative. The alternative being to trust someone, she said. Yes. The word sat between them, simple and complete. Lottie looked at her hands, the small red lines still faintly visible on her fingers from the cedar stems, 4 days healed, but not yet gone. She thought about 8 months of carrying linens and sweeping frost and making herself invisible. She thought about her mother moving from place to place with a quiet fear of belonging anywhere. She thought about Hilda's door and the food left quietly outside it by people who asked for nothing in return. Your Grace, she said. What will you do with me now? He was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with the same thorough, route-finding attention he'd given her from the very beginning, and something in his expression had settled. Not into blankness, but into the particular stillness of a decision made. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer as yourself, not as a maid addressing a king." She waited. "Stay," he said. Simply, directly. The word without ornamentation. Not in the East Wing, not carrying linens. Stay as someone this keep needs, someone who sees clearly and moves without being seen, and is not afraid of cold water or honest words. He paused. "I have spent 3 months discovering that the most dangerous thing in Ashenvale was the gap between what people said and what was true. I don't want to spend another 3 months in that gap." "You're asking me to be your eyes," she said carefully. "I'm asking you to stop being invisible," he said. "There's a difference." She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought of her mother's voice. "Packs are just power dressed in loyalty's clothing." She thought of Hilda's door. She thought of Cedric saying what you did today mattered in the plain. Accurate way of a man who did not waste words. She thought of a half-burned letter, and 3 months of cold patience, and 2 cups of broth from unglazed clay. "All right," she said. Not dramatically, not with a flood of feeling. Just 2 words, plainly spoken, in a warm room that smelled of tallow and old books, with the winter pressing against the stone walls outside, and the keep slowly, audibly finding its footing again. He nodded once. Then he stood, and she stood, and for the first time in all the mornings, they'd shared a fire and a question. They stood at the same level, looking at each other without the arrangement of king and chair and maid at table. He was, she noted, exactly as she'd understood him to be. No larger and no smaller than what she'd seen. That, she thought, was a rare thing. Epilogue. Spring came to Ashenvale late that year, as it often does to keeps built in the shadow of mountains, reluctant, creeping in from the valley first and working its way upward, thawing the courtyard stones and releasing the pine forest from its white silence in slow, patient degrees. By the time the first green appeared on the hills beyond the eastern wall, much had changed. Seraphine stood before the full council on a gray morning in early thaw, and heard her judgment read aloud by Lord Cedric in his careful, precise voice. Permanent exile from Ashenvale and all affiliated territories. Her assets and titles formally dissolved. The sentence was delivered without spectacle, which was, Lottie thought from her place near the chamber door, exactly right. Spectacle was what Seraphine had always wanted. The drama, the attention, the performance of significance. The quiet, administrative finality of that morning gave her none of it. She left the keep on a gray horse with 2 guards and a single traveling pack, and she did not look back. Lottie watched from the upper corridor window until the horse disappeared into the tree line, and then she turned away and went back to work. Marin, the healer, was told the full truth by Tristan himself, in private, with Lottie present at her own request. The old woman wept, not from guilt, which had been misplaced, but from the relief of understanding a thing that had been weighing on her without her knowing it. She had sensed something wrong for months, she said, and had told herself it was age making her fanciful. Tristan told her it was not age. It was good instinct. He asked her to stay, and she did, and the remedies she brewed in the keep's still room that spring were said by the kitchen staff to be stronger than they'd been in years. Lord Cedric remained on the council. He and Lottie developed, over the following months, the kind of relationship that has no formal name, but is immediately recognizable. A mutual respect between 2 people who notice things and have the sense to trust each other's observations. He taught her how the pack's territorial law was structured. She told him things she noticed in the corridors. Neither of them spoke about it directly. They didn't need to. The 2 council members who had been aware of Seraphine's arrangements, not architects of the plan, but knowing and silent, came to Tristan separately, within a week of each other, and offered their formal accounts and their resignations. He accepted the accounts, reviewed the resignations, and in the end, gave each man a specific, supervised role in rebuilding the Eastern Border Watch. Not absolution, not punishment. Usefulness, Under accountability. It was, Cedric said privately to Lottie, the most sensible thing a king had done in this keep in 20 years. The eastern pass was secured before the thaw completed. Harwick's pack withdrew when the border scouts confirmed that the inside arrangement was dissolved, and Ashenvale's king was, by all available evidence, very much functional and paying close attention. They did not press the point. Harwick was many things, but he was not ultimately foolish. The Valley settlement sent a delegation in late spring. 3 elders, travel-worn and cautious, who had heard what had almost happened and wanted to see the king who had stopped it. Tristan received them in the great hall, standing, with Lottie seated 3 chairs down from him at the long council table. Not as a maid, not precisely as a council member, but as someone who was clearly present and clearly there by choice, which the delegation noted and accepted without comment. The youngest of the 3 elders, a woman of perhaps 50 with sun-darkened skin and sharp eyes, looked at Lottie as she was leaving and said simply, "Good," as if she'd checked something on a list and found it satisfactory. Lottie thought about that for a long time afterward. The oak correspondence box from Seraphine's chamber was returned to the general store of the keep's furnishings. The brass key was, by unspoken agreement, not returned to the ring. Lottie kept it in the pocket of her new gray cloak, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of danger, but as a reminder of the specific morning she'd stopped choosing invisibility over truth. She had needed it to unlock something, and what it had unlocked had turned out to be considerably larger than a wooden box. In the evenings, when the keep had settled into its night rhythms, and the fires were banked, and the corridors had gone quiet, Tristan would sometimes come to the small study that had been assigned to Lottie near the keep's library, a room lined with maps and books and smelling of pine smoke and cedar, which she had furnished with 2 plain clay cups on the windowsill because it seemed right. He would bring his own questions, and she would bring her observations, and they would sit across from each other in the firelight and speak with the direct, careful honesty of 2 people who had learned, through unlikely means, to trust the same things. It was not a simple thing between them. It was not yet fully named. But it was real. As real as cold cedar in warm hands, as real as a flame that stays lit against a draft, as real as the particular warmth of a room where nothing needs to be performed and nothing needs to be hidden. Lottie had spent 23 years making herself small enough not to be noticed. She had spent 8 months in a keep full of people who looked through her as though she were part of the furniture. She had noticed things anyway. She had been honest anyway. She had carried the water and kept it hot, and walked through the door when it mattered, even when her hands were shaking. Some choices are made all at once, in a single moment of courage. But most of the important ones are made gradually, cup by cup, morning by morning, one small honest act at a time. Until the day you look up and realize the life you are living is one where you are no longer invisible, not because the world changed, but because you stopped asking it for permission to be seen. The frost returned to Ashenvale in autumn, as it always does. It crept back across the courtyard stones and built its lace patterns on the window glass, and made the pine forest silver at the edges. The keep settled into its cold routines. Boots echoed in the corridors. Fires were built high. The night patrol passed on its proper rotation, the timing unchanged. And in the small study near the library, 2 plain clay cups sat on the windowsill, and the candle burned steadily, and the door was not locked, and the water was always, reliably, hot.